Welcome to Season 2, Episode 12 of Tech Talk Thursday. The recent presidential election in the United States has raised a number of questions on how it may affect the electronics manufacturing industry, globally and in the US. Here to discuss some of the likely ramifications is John Mitchell, President of IPC, and Chris Mitchell, the Head of Government Relations at IPC. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for joining me today. And I hope you both had a great Thanksgiving holiday, which you both celebrated, of course, last week.
We did. Thank you.
Yes, it was great.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get straight into the interview, which is going to focus on the likely impact to the electronics manufacturing industry of a Biden administration. Now, the elephant in the room, of course, is the US-China trade war. It looks like both countries are still going in bipolar directions. What's the likely impact going to be from a Biden administration?
So let me start off, and I'll let Chris jump in and clean up anything or offer some additional comments, because Chris is definitely more expert than I am. But so the U.S.-China relationships, there's fairly bipartisan support in the U.S. government in an anti-China sentiment right now. So there may not be as drastic a change as you might expect with the change of administration. That being said, the Trump administration really levers tariffs and the executive power very strongly to try to enforce or to push their agenda on China and to get China to pay attention. And because those tools have been used, it's possible the Biden administration may not back off of those as much as had they never been used before. So, or used to the extent that the Trump administration did. So you may not see that much change. On the other hand, really what we'd like to see from our perspective, and we'll be trying to work with the Biden administration to communicate this, is really let's deal with the issues instead of disrupting the industry. Let's talk about, if you have grievances, let's find a way to go deal with those grievances, whether it's through the World Trade Organization or some other international body that can justly assess and then figure out the right way to get us back to working together in an equitable manner.
Right. Well, I think that's a good point, but I think a lot of people would also counter that the WTO and WHO, in the case of the pandemic, have been falling short recently.
Agreed. I think I think they've fallen short because we as various countries around the world haven't empowered them or given them the authority to really make those unilateral decisions and saying, you're wrong, you have this penalty. And I think most countries are afraid of that. But if we really want a governing body to be powerful, you need to give them the power.
You've got to give them some teeth. Yeah, definitely. So I'm sure you would agree with that, Chris, that maybe some of the tools that the Biden administration might use in this situation are going to differ a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think John hit the nail on the head. The reality is that in Washington right now, there is bipartisan consensus around a tougher line, a tougher approach to China, and given where we are in the relationship with China, I think it gives Biden an opportunity to reevaluate what's worked under the previous administration, what hasn't worked so well, and make adjustments. But I think, just as John indicated, you're not going to see a wholesale change to U.S. policy. You're going to see adjustments, and I think those adjustments will be designed to help further U.S. policy goals in a way that maybe some of the previous administration's efforts fell short. And WTO, WHO, as well as a number of other initiatives are a really good thing to look to most immediately. I think the big question for the industry is what about these tariffs, and what does President-elect Biden ultimately choose to do in terms of either continuing to keep these tariffs in place or to make adjustments. And we don't expect that there will be any immediate change to the tariffs. On the other hand, I do believe that the Biden administration will be looking for opportunities to resolve some of these longstanding trade issues with China in a way that would then lead to some changes in the tariffs. But again, it's uncertain yet what those agreements would have to look like in order for these tariffs to be reduced or eliminated.
I think the tariffs are certainly the key factor here, because if you look at the manufacturing that has come back to the Americas as a result of this trade war, has it benefited Mexico more than it's benefited the United States?
Yeah, I think our data shows that there has been a lot of the electronics manufacturing has moved out of China. It didn't come back to the U.S. in wholesale at all. It went to Mexico, it went to Southeast Asia, it went to other places, but
Right.
not so much coming back to the U.S. So if the goal was to bring it back to the U.S., I don't think it succeeded. If the goal was to weaken China, maybe it did succeed.
Right. But I mean, essentially, every time you bring a component into the United States from China, you pay a tariff on it. Then you assemble it. If you bring that component in, or these components into Mexico, and then assemble it and send it to the United States, then you're only paying the tariff once. So there's definitely, I think it was probably it's not performing the way it was meant to.
There is definitely a supply chain science that is very complex. It is definitely a calculus that you have to calculate as you go through figuring out where you need to move stuff when, because just because it came through Mexico doesn't mean you're going to avoid all those tariffs. Yeah, it's definitely the whole tariff thing has complicated the supply chains even further than they were. Anyway, Chris, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think you're right, Trevor. Right, what we saw in the aftermath of the tariffs going into effect is you saw these supply chain changes, and the companies that were best equipped to make kind of quick changes to their supply chains are those global companies with multiple
Right.
sources of supply around the world. And so you did see that. You saw sourcing that was taking place in China, as John said, moved to Southeast Asia or Mexico. The companies that had a harder time making those shifts, though, in response to the tariffs, were the small and medium-sized enterprises that, they may have had one source outside the United States, and that was in China, and kind of quickly changing gears and moving supply to another country was difficult.
Yeah, well, definitely second and third sourcing has become quite prevalent now in the industry as a result of all this.
Yeah.
The Biden administration has stated that it's going to have a fairly heavy emphasis on environmental policies. How do you think that is going to affect electronics manufacturing?
That's a good question. I think you'll find the Biden administration as a whole, both in environmental, health, as well as trade, is going to be more willing to engage with international groups. Where the Trump administration, I think you saw a generous word would be reticence to work with the international groups, as opposed to, it was almost an animosity toward them. I think that will change under the Biden administration. I'm not certain, but that's my sense looking at President-elect Biden's record heretofore. He seems to be more interested in working those. So on the environmental side, I see him looking at staying involved. But when I think of environment, the real changer there, a game changer for the industry, I think will be what's happening in the European Union. The European Union is taking a leadership position. They're looking out toward the future and trying to really design what that future ought to be like with the circular economy and just everything that affects the environment. And as we've seen in things like ROS and REACH and other types of regulations that are geared toward health, Europe has tended to take a lead in that area. And so I actually see that as the larger influencer on the electronics industry.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think historically the US has always played catch up in some respects to some of these policies that they've had over there. But the EU, as you're mentioning it, is embarking upon a fairly ambitious platform or program of reforms starting next year. based around free and fair trade, as they call it. So how do you think that's going to work with the Biden administration? Is there going to be more openness, as you say, John, or do you think it's going to be just layering on more policies that are going to, or more legislation that's going to make life more difficult for manufacturers?
Well, I think any new regulation initially will be burdensome, so as change happens, but hopefully we'll be able to collaborate with government officials. We've seen some willingness both in the US government as well as in European governments to involve industry in these decisions. And the more that can happen, the less heartache it can cause, because we all want to live in a healthy environment. There's no question about that. We've got this one planet. Let's make sure it works for a while. But on top of that, let's also try to figure out the impacts to industry and what's going to crush, small and medium-sized businesses if you suddenly put in a heavy or very burdensome regulation that requires, hey, after a certain point, I can't use this piece of equipment that is basically, 1 or 2 years of annual growth to replace. It just, the business math won't work. So let's find a way to work together with industry as we do the right thing for the environment.
Big data, artificial intelligence, and smart factory solutions are here now. Automated optical inspection is critical in a smart factory environment. Leading the way to Industry 4.0, Murtech invites you to the smart factory of the future.
I mean, one thing I've noticed with the different administrations, I mean, the European Union does bring in a lot of regulation over things, but the enforcement seems to be fairly loose. It's usually devolved to the member countries and that type of thing to enforce it, and they have different ways of doing that. But whereas in the United States, if they pass the law over there and you fall,
you shut your business down if you don't do it.
Shut your business down, and you go to jail. So
that's right.
It's kind of different from both sides, but definitely interesting.
But Trevor, I would add, I mean, there's risks and opportunities anytime government takes action. Risks and opportunities for industry and for all other stakeholders, and so. And that's certainly the case in Europe with the kind of the ambitious agenda that the Commission has set. Here in the United States, the perspective on the at least on the business side has been one of wariness and caution anytime government regulates. And in this new administration, we're going to need to be working to make sure that we're safeguarding the industry's interests, that in this very competitive global landscape, that we are helping work with policymakers to ensure that there's an environment in which U.S. companies can continue to thrive. All that being said, there has to be an opportunity for and a consensus around what the future of environmental regulation looks like. And I'm struck with the way in which Europe is talking about circular economy in the context of industrial policy. So circular economy is a central tenet to their industrial policy goals, and they're really still at an early phase in the implementation of that agenda in Europe. In the United States, we do need to think about more closely about how some of these environmental opportunities can be just that, opportunities to help grow our economy as well, and not in the kind of the rhetorical way that oftentimes is characterized the discussions. But when you get right down to it, how do we help support the growth of the industry through an emphasis on some of these environmental goals? And I think that pertains not just to the environmental goals, but on the industrial policy side, these can't just be rhetorical commitments. There has to, I think what is being asked of governments now is to think more deeply, more creatively, and more concretely about what kind of policies they can put in place that help the industry migrate into smarter factories, factories of the future, and so forth.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things here is the IPC's at least got a seat at the table.
Yes.
You actually were taking part in some of these discussions that have been going on recently in Europe, which is keeping you at the forefront of it and on being an awareness of what's happening over there, and that's information that you can then bring back. And if you think it's useful, then you can also lobby it in Washington as well.
Yeah, I mean, really, the decisions made in the U.S., Europe, and China, European Union and China, are impacting our members across the globe. So that's why IPC stays involved in all of these. It's not like it's an isolated, the policies may have more of a direct effect on the local companies, but there are far-reaching implications to every company in the world, just about every company in the world, that as you have environmental policies, industrial policies, one of the things, let me just bring it back to the Biden administration, and one of the hopes I think that we have is we didn't really see much of an infrastructure package progressed under the Trump administration here in the United States. As you think about the environmental impact, if you can couple that with an infrastructure plan or strategy that you could, in a environmentally sound way, improve the infrastructure, I think that's an opportunity that could have far-reaching effects in a positive way for the industry here in North America. And yeah, so I think that's one of the hopes that we have as we go forward here, because right now the infrastructure in the U.S. needs some work.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've got a lot of infrastructure issues over there that need attention. Chris, if I can just turn to you for a second. You recently posted a tweet where you expressed some concern over the recently formed RCEP in Asia, and you said there was some frustration among members in the United States about this. Are you referring to suppliers who wanted access to that Asian market, or did you have another meaning?
I think more broadly, there is a recognition on the part of industry that the current administration stepped away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we have since then pursued bilateral trade agreements with limited success, and it has come at the expense of multilateral agreements. And so as we look at Asia, even though we've taken some pretty strong actions, the U.S. government has taken some pretty strong actions relative to China, the reality is that we probably don't today have a strong, coherent strategy when it comes to U.S. relations with Asia, and there is a lack of U.S. leadership. The RCEP is, I think, a good indicator that we're not working as broadly, as closely in a multilateral fashion with our trading partners to fashion agreements that further the industry's interests, U.S. interests in that region. And so I think, from our perspective, we would like to see a U.S. government that engages more cooperatively with other countries around the world to help establish a level playing field for all countries.
Okay. I would just get back to the TTIP and TPP efforts that were going on, 5 years ago or so. I mean, really, you've lost North America from them, which is a shame. And so if you want to, you're going to end up.
Yeah, your southern neighbor, Mexico, has got more free trade agreements than any other country in the world.
Yeah, and they're booming.
Yeah. It's an interesting area for sure.
Yeah.
But
Trevor, I would add as well. I mean, if you look at IPC and its mission, we're all about bringing industry globally together to further the grow the industry and under a common framework, under a common set of standards workforce practices, and so whether it's in North America, Europe, or Asia, our inclination is to want to encourage governments to be equally cooperative in building consensus around common rules. And I think that's been probably a U.S. failing here over the last few years. And so we'd like to, I think that's one of the positives in a future Biden administration, is this desire to reestablish kind of multilateral ties, strengthen multilateral institutions like the WTO.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of good things happened over the last few years as well.
Absolutely.
Had to be taken on. But I mean, we're not going to dive into the politics of this. We're sticking strictly with the electronics. My final question is this one. It's a kind of strange one, but I mean, I'm looking at the pandemic we've had here with COVID, coronavirus. Could technology have done a better job to avoid the devastation that essentially this disease has caused?
Sure. If we wanted to implement it, I mean, I think there are technological solutions if we would have broadly implemented it. And some countries did a great job of this. In terms of scanning people and tracking people. So technology could have taken a much larger role across North America and Europe to help to stymie it much more than it did. I think the difference is the way the countries implemented or utilized that technology quickly. So could it have taken a bigger role in having an impact? Definitely. I think the technology was there. I think the technology is also there in trying to drive forward vaccines, which I think faster than anybody really expected are getting to the point where any moment we're expecting a release.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think, and one thing that should be remembered as well is, of course, a lot of these Asian countries that did a better job of handling the pandemic had the previous experience of SARS and
that's right.
H1N1, and so of course they were more prepared for this.
Yeah, COVID shows up, implement the SARS protocol, go. It was just like ready and run.
Right, exactly.
And Trevor, you alluded to the fact that a number of really good things have happened over the last few years as well, and as we think about the pandemic, there's always the ability to learn after the fact, and I think we have learned not just after the fact, but in the process. And again, a bright area I think over the last few years for U.S. manufacturers has been the investment in the defense industrial base here in the United States, and to the degree that those investments have been able to be leveraged in then the mitigation and addressing of the pandemic. That's certainly been a positive. I mean, we've seen again some of the investments that have made in the context of the defense industrial base. They have been leveraged, and I think to pretty good effect in order to
broader.
Sorry
to interrupt, Chris.
Yeah.
So, but even broader than just the defense industrial base, I think regions are looking at the entire ecosystem for the electronics manufacturing piece more closely than they ever have, because you just don't know when, for reasons of something like a pandemic, you might just have your typical supply chains broken. Yeah. And so you need to broaden those into supply networks or whatever you might want to call them.
Yeah, there's definitely been a need even before COVID to mitigate that risk. I mean, there could be any sort of geopolitical event that happens. We had a right. volcano went off here a few years ago.
This just put a bright spotlight right on it, and people are like, "Oh my gosh, I can't get X. Yeah, there's a problem. What's the problem?" Now we can actually see what that problem is.
That's right. So, no, it's a changing world, and it's a fascinating one right now. But gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for coming in and talking to me about this today. It's a topic I'm sure we'll be talking about for a long time to come still. John, Chris, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Trevor.
Yeah. Well, that's it for another edition of Tech Talk Thursday. Join me next week for a panel on low temperature solders. And of course, next Thursday, we'll be back with another edition of Tech Talk Thursday. Till then, stay safe, and have a great weekend.
Global SMT and Packaging opens the windows of the world to bring you the latest news and technologies from Munich, from Bangalore, from Shanghai, from San Diego.